The text arrived at 11:42 p.m. My phone didn't buzz. It simply lit up in the darkness of my living room, a silent grenade tossed into the center of my life. The sender was Brian Sterling, my father, and the CEO of the hospitality empire I had spent the last decade keeping upright. It wasn't a family message. There were no emojis, no softening of the blow. It was a corporate execution delivered via text. Effective immediately, your access is revoked. We need visionaries, not obstacles. Do not come in tomorrow. I stared at the glowing screen. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I felt a strange, cold calm wash over me, the kind a soldier feels when they're finally discharged from a losing war. I set the phone down, picked up my laptop, and typed a single word in reply. Understood. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. To understand why I didn't cry that night, you have to understand the architecture of the Sterling family. To the outside world, Sterling Hospitality was a glittering empire of boutique hotels, rooftop bars, and Michelin-starred restaurants. It was sleek, modern, and effortlessly profitable. But I knew the truth. I was the director of operations, which is a fancy corporate title for the janitor. While my sister Jessica, the golden child and VP of development, spent millions on branding parties, influencers, and custom scents for the lobbies, I was in the basement, renegotiating linen contracts and cutting staff hours just to make payroll. Jessica was the face of the brand, charismatic, stunning, and utterly reckless. I was the spine, invisible, essential, and slowly breaking under the weight. For 10 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of reality. When Jessica overspent the marketing budget by $200,000 for a launch event that was just an excuse to party with her friends, I was the one who moved funds from the maintenance account to cover it so our checks wouldn't bounce. When my father Brian wanted to buy a third vacation home to project success, I was the one who quietly refinanced the downtown property to free up the cash. They lived in the penthouse of the House of Cards. I was the one in the cellar holding the foundation together with duct tape and 80-hour weeks. They called it family loyalty. Now, staring at that text message, I realized it had been a subscription service, and I was the only one paying the bill. I haven't cried since I was 12 years old. I remember the day clearly because it was the day I learned the most important rule of being a Sterling. I had fallen off my bike on the gravel driveway, scraping my knee raw. Blood was running down my shins, staining my white socks. I ran inside looking for my mother, looking for comfort. I found her in the drawing room reviewing blueprints for the very first Sterling hotel. She looked at my bleeding leg, then at the pristine white carpet, and her face tightened. She didn't rush to me. She didn't ask if I was okay. She pointed to the door. "Haley," she said, her voice devoid of warmth, "go clean yourself up. Emotion is messy, and we don't do messy." That was the lesson. In my family, feelings were a liability. Vulnerability was blood in the water. If you wanted to survive, you became a machine. You became useful. You became cold. So over the years, I calloused over my heart just like I calloused over my hands. I became the fixer, the one who cleaned up Jessica's messes without complaint, the one who absorbed the stress so my parents could maintain their illusion of perfection. I built a cage around my emotions so strong that nothing could get in and nothing could get out. When that text came through, firing me for trying to save them, it didn't hurt. It just confirmed what I had always known but refused to admit. I wasn't a daughter to them. I was an appliance. I was a tool they used to keep the lights on, and now that the tool had spoken back, they were discarding it. But here's the thing about treating people like appliances. You forget that they have access to the power source. They forgot that the person who built the system knows exactly where the structural weaknesses are. They thought they were firing a subordinate. They didn't realize they were unplugging the life support. The unraveling began 3 weeks earlier on a Tuesday afternoon that looked exactly like every other Tuesday in my life. I was sitting in my office surrounded by 3 monitors reviewing the quarterly expense reports, a task Jessica considered beneath her creative station. The numbers flowed past my eyes like a digital river, until one line item snagged my attention like a jagged rock. A wire transfer for $125,000 labeled Marble Upgrades, Onyx Hotel Lobby. I paused. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. It seemed standard enough for a luxury brand except for one small stubborn detail. I had visited the Onyx Hotel 2 days prior for a routine inspection. The lobby floor was still the same high-traffic industrial carpet we'd installed 5 years ago. There was no marble. There wasn't a construction crew. There wasn't even a permit posted in the window. My stomach didn't drop. It tightened. It was the sharp, cold instinct of a hunter-spotting movement in the brush. I pulled the vendor file for the recipient. The company was called Luckstone Interiors. No website, no portfolio, no physical address, just a P.O. box in Delaware. I started digging, dragging the river for more bodies. I pulled every invoice from the last 24 months. The pattern emerged instantly stark and undeniable. Roof repairs at the Sapphire Lounge. Custom lighting for the Jade Suite. Structural reinforcements at the Diamond Tower. $15 million in renovation contracts paid out to 3 different shell companies, all tracing back to the same registered agent. Jessica. I didn't scream. I didn't storm into her office. That would be emotional, and I don't do emotional. I compiled the data. I built a dossier thicker than a phone book. I printed bank statements, cross-referenced construction logs with security footage to prove no crews ever entered the buildings, and verified that not a single nail had been driven for that $15 million. Then I called an emergency family meeting. We gathered in the boardroom of the Sterling headquarters, a glass-walled aquarium suspended over downtown Chicago. My parents sat at the head of the table, impatient, checking their watches. Jessica sat opposite me, scrolling through her phone, bored, looking like she was waiting for a manicure appointment. I found a discrepancy, I said, sliding the dossier across the mahogany table. The sound of the heavy paper hitting the wood echoed in the silence. $15 million in payments for renovations that never happened. The money went to shell companies owned by Jessica. I watched them closely. I expected shock. I expected horror. I expected my parents to look at their golden child and finally see the thief beneath the designer clothes. Instead, my mother picked up the report, glanced at the first page, and tossed it back at me. "Oh, Haley," she sighed, rubbing her temples as if I had spilled juice on the carpet. "Always the accountant. You simply don't understand vision." "This isn't vision, Mother," I said, my voice flat. "This is embezzlement. $15 million is gone." "It's not gone," my father snapped, his face reddening, not with anger at the theft, but with annoyance at the messenger. "It's allocated. Jessica is building a brand. Sometimes you have to move capital around creatively to prepare for future growth. You're just too small-minded to see the big picture." I looked at Jessica. She smirked, a small, victorious curl of her lip. She knew. She knew she was untouchable. And in that moment, I realized the depth of the sickness in this room. My parents weren't blind. They were complicit. This was the trap of normalized cruelty. They had spent 30 years constructing a mythology around our family. The Sterlings are perfect. The Sterlings are winners. Jessica was the physical embodiment of that myth, beautiful, charming, successful. To admit that she was a criminal would mean admitting that their perfect daughter was flawed. It would mean admitting their parenting was a failure. It would shatter the entire fragile reality they had built their egos upon. They were psychologically incapable of seeing the truth because the truth would destroy their identity. They would rather burn $15 million than bruise their own egos. They chose the comfortable lie over the painful truth. And by attacking me, they were protecting their delusion. "You're jealous," my mother added, her voice dripping with venom. "You've always been jealous of her spark." I stood up. I didn't argue. I realized then that you cannot use logic to wake someone who is pretending to be asleep. "I see," I said. "I'll leave the report here." I walked out of the glass room, leaving the dossier on the table like a bomb that hadn't detonated yet. 6 hours later, I got the text. We returned to the apartment, to the heavy silence that settled after the text message faded from the screen. "We need visionaries, not obstacles." The words burned into the retina of my mind, a final, arrogant insult. They thought they had silenced me. They believed that by cutting off my access badge and my salary, they had severed the threat. They assumed I would do what I had always done, retreat into the shadows, apologize for taking up space, and find a desperate way to be useful again from the outside. They relied on the daughter they had trained to be a doormat. They forgot they were dealing with the executive they had trained to be a shark. They had fired the only person who knew where the bodies were buried, and in their arrogance they had handed me the shovel. I didn't pace the floor. I didn't call a friend to vent or cry into a pillow. I didn't even pour a drink. Alcohol is a depressant, and I needed to be sharp. I sat on my couch and opened my laptop. I knew something my parents didn't. The IT department at Sterling Hospitality was understaffed and overworked because I had cut their budget 6 months ago to pay for Jessica's rebranding trip to Milan. Revoking executive clearances usually took 48 hours on a weekend. I had a window. I logged into the secure server. My credentials still worked. The green light of access blinked at me, a digital open door. I didn't go in to delete files. Deleting is petty. Deleting is obstruction of justice. This wasn't about revenge. It was about the law. It was about survival. If I walked away now silent and compliant when the inevitable audit hit, I wouldn't just be the fired daughter. I would be the complicit director of operations. I would be the one in the orange jumpsuit because I was the one who signed the checks. I went to work with the precision of a surgeon performing an autopsy. I accessed the Luckstone folder. I downloaded every contract, every change order, every invoice that corresponded to a non-existent renovation. I went into the email archives. I found the chains where Jessica joked with her shell company registered agent about creative accounting and making the numbers dance. I found the emails where my parents authorized transfers without reading the attachments. I downloaded the metadata that proved when files were created and by whom. I packaged gigabytes of incriminating data into a single encrypted file. I named it the Silent Ledger. Then I opened a new tab. I navigated to the website of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I clicked on the whistleblower portal. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. This was corporate fraud at a level that implicated executive leadership in a company with investors. I filled out the form. I didn't use emotional language. I didn't talk about my childhood or my sister's golden status. I spoke the language of federal agents. Systematic embezzlement. Tax evasion. Falsified vendor contracts. I attached the file. Then I did the same for the IRS whistleblower office. I typed out my statement. I am the former director of operations. I have evidence of misappropriation of funds totaling $15 million authorized by the VP of Development and enabled by the CEO. I hovered my finger over the Enter key. I knew that once I pressed it, there was no going back. This wasn't just burning a bridge. It was nuking the landscape. It would destroy the company I had spent my adult life building. It would ruin my parents' reputation. It would send my sister to prison. A normal person might have hesitated. A normal person might have felt a pang of guilt. But I remembered the white carpet. I remembered we don't do messy. I hit submit. The screen flashed a confirmation number. It was done. I closed my laptop and set it on the table. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of tap water. I held it up to the light. My hand was perfectly steady. The bridge was burned, and I was the one holding the match. The raid happened 2 weeks later. It was a Tuesday morning, gray and rainy, the kind of Chicago weather that feels like the city is trying to wash itself clean. I wasn't there, of course. I was in my new apartment sitting on a secondhand velvet sofa drinking black coffee and watching the news. Federal agents raid Sterling Hospitality headquarters. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen, in bold red letters, relentless and loud. I watched the footage shot from a news helicopter circling above. Agents in navy blue windbreakers with yellow FBI lettering were carrying boxes out of the building. The same glass-walled aquarium where my parents had told me I lacked vision. It turned out my vision was perfectly fine. I had just been looking at a crime scene. Seeing the empire I built being dismantled box by box should have felt like a tragedy. Instead, it felt like a controlled demolition. The structure had been rotten for years. Gravity was just finally doing its job. My phone started ringing almost immediately. It was Evan, the head of PR. Evan was a good man but soft. He followed the money and the loudest voice in the room, which meant he had spent the last 5 years terrified of Jessica. Haley, he whispered, panic choking his voice. I could hear sirens in the background, a chaotic symphony of consequences. They're everywhere. They have warrants. They're taking the servers. They're taking the physical files. Jessica. Jessica is gone. I took a slow sip of coffee. Gone. She didn't come in today. Her assistant went to her apartment. It's empty, Haley. The closets are cleared out. Her accounts are drained. We checked the corporate liquidity. She took the last $5 million in cash reserves and booked a one-way flight to a non-extradition country. She ran. She actually ran. I felt a flicker of something cold in my chest. Not surprise. Jessica was a parasite. When the host body begins to die, the parasite doesn't mourn. It moves on. She had gutted the company, and now she was leaving the carcass for the scavengers. She left Mom and Dad holding the bag. Evan continued, his voice rising in hysteria. But Haley, it's worse. The agents aren't just asking about the shell companies. They're asking about the tax filings. They have documents with your parents' signatures authorizing the transfers to Luckstone. They think Brian and Susan were the masterminds. I set my coffee cup down on the coaster. That doesn't make sense, I said, my mind shifting into analysis mode. My parents are enablers. They are narcissists who care more about their country club standing than their balance sheet. But they aren't stupid enough to sign their names to federal crimes. They protect the brand above all else. I'm telling you, the agents showed me the authorizations. The signatures are there. Brian and Susan Sterling clear as day, approving every single fraudulent wire transfer. The feds think Jessica was just the bagman, and your parents were the architects. I froze. The pieces clicked together with a sickening precision. Send me a copy of those documents, I ordered. Right now, Evan. He hesitated, terrified of violating some protocol he didn't understand, but then my phone pinged with an image. I opened it on my tablet and zoomed in. The document was a transfer authorization for $2 million to Luckstone Interiors. At the bottom, the signature block. There it was, my father's looping script, oversized and arrogant. Next to it, my mother's sharp, angular autograph. To the naked eye, they were perfect. But I wasn't looking with a naked eye. I was looking with the eyes of someone who had processed their paperwork for a decade. I zoomed in further, until the pixels blurred. Something was off. The pressure was too uniform. In a wet signature, the pen lifts and presses. The ink pools in the curves. These lines were flat. I swiped to the next document Evan had sent. Then the next. I overlaid the signatures in my mind. They were identical. Not similar, identical. No human signs their name the exact same way twice. The spacing, the angle, the terminal stroke, it was a match down to the millimeter. These weren't wet signatures. They were digital stamps. I realized then the true depth of Jessica's depravity. She hadn't just stolen the money. She hadn't just acted out of greed. She had anticipated this moment for years. She had stolen our parents' digital signature files, the ones I used for low-level vendor approvals, and she had stamped them onto every single fraudulent contract. She had framed them. She had set up her own mother and father as the fall guys to ensure that if the ship went down, she would be the only one with a life raft. My parents weren't just facing bankruptcy and public humiliation. They were facing 20 years in federal prison for embezzlement and tax evasion they didn't commit, but had blindly enabled by giving Jessica the keys to the kingdom. The irony was suffocating. They had spent their lives protecting the golden child, shielding her from consequences, insisting she could do no wrong. They had protected the wolf because she looked like a sheep, and now she had eaten them alive. They had fired the only person who could have saved them to protect the person who destroyed them. Haley, Evan asked, his voice tinny through the speaker. Are you there? What do I tell the agents? Tell them the truth, I said, my voice hard as diamond. Tell them Jessica is gone. Tell them the money is gone. And your parents? They're in the conference room with the FBI right now. They look broken, Haley. Good, I said. Let them sit in it. I hung up the phone. I looked at the digital forgeries on my screen. I held the key to their freedom in my hands. I could prove the fraud. I could prove the frame-up. I could save them from prison. But saving them from prison wouldn't save them from the truth. And for Brian and Susan Sterling, the truth was a far more brutal sentence. 3 days after the raid, there was a knock at my door. It wasn't the aggressive pounding of authority or the polite tap of a neighbor. It was hesitant, almost weak. I knew who it was before I looked through the peephole. I had been expecting them. I opened the door but didn't step aside. My parents stood in the hallway of my modest apartment building, bathed in the flickering fluorescent light. They looked 20 years older than they had a month ago. My father, Brian, once a titan who filled every room he entered with the sheer force of his ego, was slumped over his suit, wrinkled and smelling faintly of stale scotch. My mother, Susan, who never left the house without perfect hair and a designer handbag looked pale and trembling, clutching a plastic folder like a life preserver. They were no longer the masters of the universe. They were just two scared aging people who had lost the only thing that mattered to them. Haley, my mother, choked out tears welling in her eyes instantly. Please. We didn't know. Jessica. She tricked us. The FBI thinks we authorized it. They think we're the masterminds. We need your help, my father pleaded, his voice breaking on the last word. You know the systems. You know how to track the digital footprints better than anyone. You can prove we didn't sign those papers. You have to help us. We're family. I looked at them, really looked at them. I saw the fear, yes. But underneath the terror, I saw the expectation. Even now, standing in the ashes of a fire they let burn, they expected me to be the fixer. They expected me to grab the fire extinguisher and clean up the mess just like I cleaned up my scraped knee when I was 12. They wanted me to save them from the consequences of their own toxic love. They wanted the janitor back. I didn't scream. I didn't lecture them about the irony of asking the daughter they fired to save their lives. I simply turned around and walked to the entry table where a single manila envelope lay waiting. I had printed the forensic report the night before, the one proving the signatures were digital forgeries created from Jessica's IP address. I had already sent a copy to the FBI agent in charge of the case. I walked back and handed the envelope to my father. His hands shook as he took it. This is a forensic analysis of the metadata from the transfer authorizations. I said, my voice calm and steady. It proves the signatures are digital stamps applied from a device registered to Jessica in the Cayman Islands. It proves you didn't sign them. Relief washed over their faces, pitiful and desperate. My mother let out a sob, reaching for my hand, but I stepped back. Oh, thank God, she cried. Thank you, Haley. We knew you would. But I interrupted, my voice hard as a diamond cutting through her gratitude. It also proves that as CEO and chairman you were grossly negligent. It proves you allowed $20 million to be stolen from under your noses because you refused to read the reports I gave you. It proves you were incompetent. The hope on their faces froze. This report will keep you out of prison, I continued. You won't go to jail for fraud, but the Securities and Exchange Commission will bar you from ever holding executive office again. The fines for negligence will take the rest of the company assets. You will be free, but you will be ruined. The Sterling name will be mud. They stared at me, the realization sinking in. I wasn't saving their legacy. I was saving their bodies and burying their egos. You chose the lie, I said, placing my hand on the doorknob. Now you have to live with the truth. Goodbye. As I began to close the door, I looked at my father one last time. He looked small. He looked hollow. And in that moment, I understood the illusion of the power of an empty wallet. For my entire life, I had thought my parents were powerful. I thought they were giants. But their power wasn't internal. It was rented. It was built on money status and the perception of success. It was a costume they wore to hide the fact that they were empty inside. Without the money, without the title, they were nothing. They didn't have resilience. They didn't have integrity. They only had things. And now that the things were gone, they were evaporating. I, on the other hand, had nothing. I had no fortune, no legacy, no family, but I was standing tall, because my power came from what I was, not what I had. Haley, wait, my mother called out, a desperate, ragged sound. I didn't wait. I closed the door. The latch clicked shut with a final satisfying sound. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door and listened to their footsteps retreat down the hallway. I breathed in the silence of my apartment. It didn't feel lonely. It felt clean. The aftermath was swift, brutal, and entirely by the book. Sterling hospitality didn't collapse in a fiery explosion. It was dismantled piece by piece by the cold mechanics of the law. To pay the $25 million in fines and restitution levied by the SEC and the IRS, the board of directors, what was left of them, voted to liquidate. I watched from a distance as the hotels were sold off to a competitor for pennies on the dollar. I saw photos online of the Sterling name being scraped off the glass facades of the buildings my parents had worshipped like cathedrals. The onyx, the jade, the sapphire, they were all rebranded within 6 months. The legacy Brian and Susan Sterling had sacrificed their daughter to protect was erased as if it had never existed. My parents avoided prison thanks to the forensic report I provided. But they lost something they valued far more than their freedom, their relevance. They were barred from holding officer positions in any public company. Their assets were seized. The penthouse, the cars, the country club memberships, all gone. They live now in a 2-bedroom condo in a suburb they used to make fun of. I don't visit. I don't call. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that my father spends his days staring at the television, and my mother tells anyone who will listen that they were victims of a sophisticated cyber attack. They still can't speak the truth. They are trapped in a prison of their own, making serving a life sentence of irrelevance. And Jessica, she is still running. The last I heard, she was in a coastal town in South America that doesn't have an extradition treaty with the United States. She has some money, I'm sure. She managed to squirrel away enough to live comfortably. But for a narcissist like Jessica, living in hiding is a special kind of hell. She has no audience. She has no admirers. She is a queen without a kingdom, looking over her shoulder every day, knowing that she can never come home. She is free, but she is entirely alone. As for me, I didn't go back to corporate life. I didn't want to be anyone's employee again. I took my severance, which I legally demanded before the accounts were frozen, and I started my own firm. I called it Veritas Operations. I sit here now in my own office. It isn't a glass aquarium floating over the city. It's a converted loft with exposed brick and big industrial windows that let in the morning light. I don't have a title like VP of Vision. I am a forensic accountant and operational consultant. Companies hire me to find the rot in their foundations before it brings the house down. I am expensive. I am ruthless. And I am very, very busy. I pour a cup of coffee and sit by the window. The city below is waking up. For the first time in my life, the silence around me isn't heavy. It doesn't feel like the calm before a screaming match or the tension of a secret being kept. It feels like peace. I look at the ledger on my desk, my own ledger this time. The numbers balance. The debts are paid. There are no red flags, no hidden columns, no phantom renovations. It is clean. I realized something during the fall of the Sterling Empire. Loyalty is a currency, and you have to be careful where you spend it. I spent mine on people who were bankrupt of integrity, and it nearly destroyed me. But when I finally invested in myself, the return was infinite. I lost a family, yes, but I found a life. And sitting here in the quiet morning drinking coffee I bought with my own money in a business built on my own name, I know one thing for certain. I finally have vision. If you've ever had to walk away to save yourself, or if you're still building the courage to do it like this video, and subscribe. Let's build a community that values truth over toxic loyalty. Share your story below, I read every single one.